In this lesson, we want to look at variables and constants and literals in Python. And we want to have a look at how to initialize them and some of the issues we may have to deal with when we move different data types in and out of variables. Now, numbers are an important data type in Python programs. So this means that we can assign a number, and we have multiple types of numbers into a variable. And the type of number we use is called a data type. So these are the fundamental building blocks we're going to use to build much more complex programs and data structures. So we can use integer values or we can use real numbers. So let's have a look at what they are. So a data type, when we look at the value 3, this is an integer, so it can also be a negative number, -3 or 0. These are all integers. Or we can have a real number, so a number that can have a decimal place. So 3.0, for example, would be a floating point number or a real number. So in Python, we call these floats. Now, a data type is just a way to describe the type of data we have stored in a variable. And usually, when we're talking about mathematical functions, we're talking about an integer or a float, although we can also store textual data inside variables. So a variable is just a name that we use to refer to a particular value in memory. Now, we're very used to things like x and y. So x, for example, can have a value of 10 and y can have a value of 20. In this case, x and y are both variables. And that means we can use the name, such as x or y, to reference the value that's stored in that location. Of course, the value of 10 and 20 can change over time, and our variable name would remain the same. It would just reference a new number. So when we initialize a variable, in other words, we create it for the first time, the first thing we have to do is have a name. So in this case, we have our x or our y, and then we assign a value. And the process of defining a variable is really just using this statement. So a variable name is equal to, or assigned equal to, a literal value or even another variable. So in this case, x is 10 and y is 20. Constants in Python are where we have a value in a variable, but it should not change after it's been assigned. So once we set an initial value, we don't want to change this value, and we want to have that variable referred to throughout the program as a constant value that is immutable. It is, of course, possible to change these, but it's really bad programming practice to do so. So when you take a constant, you need to make sure that the value that you put into it remains the same. Now, a literal is just a value that we store in a variable or in a constant. So they can be a form of an integer, as we've already seen, or a floating point number, which is a number with a decimal value in it. And of course, they can be positive or they can be negative. Okay, let's have a look at a small example of a small program initializing variables. Our first variable is called len, and we're going to assign that equal to 10, and we're just going to print out the value of that so we can see what it is. And of course, that's 10. Now, 10 is a literal value. It's an integer, so the data type within the variable len is an integer. If we want to maybe introduce a new variable called area, and we'll say the length of this is the len multiplied by 2.1. And in this case, we're going to print out area. Now we have a value of 21.0. Because we have an integer multiplied by a float, we need to record that as a floating point number, which is 21.0. Now let's proceed through this, and we are now going to take the area, and we're going to say that's equal to its own value minus 0.1. And this, of course, would remove the decimal place from the end if we had one. We run this and we have 20.9. So let's remove 0.9, and that will get us down to the value of 20. But here we have 20.0. Because we were using floating point numbers already, this is going to stay as a data type of type float. We can't change that by doing more arithmetic. We can't take it away to change it from a float back to an integer. We would have to set it to an integer value to change the data type. Let's move on though and change the area, because we don't maybe currently know what it is, to be a text value of TBD, or to be decided. And if we run this program, we see that ultimately the area is set to TBD. This means that the initial variable, which was a float, has now changed. And if we try and do operations on this variable without realizing that it is now a different data type, we will get maybe an unusual answer if you're not ready for it. So an area could be put into an area multiplied by 2. And if we multiply a string by 2, we're literally just doubling the string. So we get TBD, TBD, which is maybe not what we would have expected. However, because this is a string, not all operations are going to make sense. So if we happen to add the value of 20.1 to it, as shown, then we get an error. And the error here is that we can't add an integer to a string value and get a reasonable value out of that. So that just doesn't work. So let's just get rid of that. And let's go on to maybe our final option, which is area is equal to the length multiplied by the width. So in this case, length, the last value of this was 10. And we haven't yet defined width at this point. So if I try and run this program, it will give me another error saying it's not defined. So we have to put something in there. So before we can use a variable, we have to actually define it. So we just say width is equal to 2. It now has a value. If we run it, we get the answer of 20.